Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this afternoon's roundtable. We're just going to give a few minutes for people to start coming in because I know our previous session ran right up to the wire. So I think we'll expect people to come in drips and drabs for the first 5 minutes. But just a reminder, thank you for those for putting your cameras on. Please do keep them on. We like these to be interactive sessions and to make sure that everyone has a chance to engage with one another. Just a reminder that you can use the chat function to put your questions in for Rachael during this session. And we'd love for you to ask your questions out loud. So put them into the chat and then our moderator, Terry, can call on you to ask them out loud. But people will continue to join for the first few minutes. So apologies for a little bit of a slow start. We have a really important and interesting discussion lined up for you today. And that's looking at the science behind a lot of these systems that we're talking about, specifically looking at mental health in older adults. We've got a wonderful speaker for you, Rachael Frost, who has spoken at length for us before on this topic. I'm very interested to explore some of the lifestyle factors and other things when we're talking about mental health. But to get started, I'm going to hand over to our moderator today. Not only is he my CEO at LSX, he's a huge personal advocate of the mental health space and of the longevity space. So the best possible person to lead us through today's discussion. Terry, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Angela, and welcome everyone. I'm really pleased to be able to moderate this discussion. As Angela said, I have a personal passion and interest in this topic, so it really is a privilege to be able to sit here and moderate this discussion. Before we go forward, I would like to ask everyone if you wouldn't mind just adding your affiliation to your name. So if you hover over your image, you should see 3 dots on the top right. If you click that, you should be able to see a button that says rename. And if you could just add next to your name a dash and your affiliation. So you can see on mine, I have -LSX and Rachael has -UCL. If people wouldn't mind doing that now, that'd be great. And also, I'd encourage people to use the gallery view if you can. As Ange said, it's quite nice to be able to see everybody's faces. Great, thank you. Okay, so before we hand over to Rachael to get us going here with a slideshow she's prepared, I wanted to just ask people here if they wouldn't mind letting me know if anyone here has an older person in their life who is currently struggling with mental health. Can you type yes or no into the chat? Okay. And maybe a corollary to that, who here knows an older person whose mental health has been compromised in the last 12 months? Again, in the chat, yes or no? Okay. Yeah, so I think it's as we'll see, I think in Rachael's presentation, mental health is an extraordinarily important topic and an extraordinarily prevalent problem when it comes to older age. And so I think it is incredibly important that we address this and try to look at what are some of the most useful and valuable interventions that we can take to address this. So I'm going to hand over now to Rachael to talk us through some of the science behind the systems here. Rachael, do you want to maybe briefly introduce yourself and your research in the way that you would like to be known and introduced, and then walk us through your thoughts on this subject matter?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Dr. Rachael Frost. I'm a Senior Research Fellow in the Department of Primary Care and Population Health at University College London. And a lot of my research focuses on promoting mental and physical health in later life, with a particular emphasis on mental health. And we've done a lot of work in looking at older people's perspectives on this, healthcare professionals' perspectives on this, and how we might address and treat that, and what the evidence base behind those different treatments are. So I'm delighted to share some of that with you today, sort of showcasing a bit of my own research and what the stuff that's going on out in the wider world, both from a sort of health systems perspective and I guess kind of more individual interventions that older people can do for themselves. So I'm just going to share my screen now. So can everybody see that okay? Yeah, brilliant. So starting with really, I want to start by talking about how common depression, anxiety in later life actually are, because it is such a prevalent issue, really. And it's something that not everyone's aware of, or they're aware of as sort of a background thing that people sort of take for granted. So I'm not sure whether it's surprising or not, the stats to you, but just under 40% of older people have depressive symptoms, and just over 40% have symptoms of anxiety. And although symptoms aren't quite the same as a diagnosed disorder, those rates are still quite high. So you have 7.2% of adults aged over 75 with a diagnosis of major depression, and between 3 and 14% of adults, depending on the study that you look at, with an anxiety disorder. And one of the trends that we do notice is that those who are more dependent, so those who are frailer, who might live in care homes, do have much higher rates. So this is a really problematic issue. And also that it's not necessarily one or the other with depression, anxiety. Actually, the vast majority of people, either one in later life, actually have symptoms of both. But I will say, and this is a theme that you'll notice throughout the rest of the presentation, is that anxiety is a lot less studied than depression, both in terms of its factors affecting it and the impact on older people. So why should we care about it? Firstly, on the sort of individual level for an older person, if they have depression, they have almost a 4 times higher risk of becoming frail over the next 3 years, and higher odds of disability over the next 3 years, as well as increased risk of dementia and mortality and a lower quality of life. There's also the impact on health and social care. So we know that older people who are depressed are more likely to visit their GP, and they're more likely to move into long-term care. So it's really indicative of a kind of downward spiral here. The anxiety, it hasn't been studied in terms of the effects on health and social care quite as much, but there are quite strong associations with effects on memory. So whether or not that sort of, anxiety is a sort of foreshadowing symptom of coming mild cognitive impairment or dementia, or whether it's a risk factor, is at the moment a little bit unclear. But what we do know is that people who are anxious later on, sort of a few years down the line, they're much more likely to be diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment or dementia. Similarly, people with both depression and anxiety are also likely to have an increased disability risk. So the really important things to address. I just wanted to start by myth busting a few ideas from what we've talked to older people. There's often these assumptions that people don't know much about depression or anxiety, or it's all down to later life. And actually, for a lot of people, depression was quite a familiar concept and something that they might have lived with at different periods within their life, and isn't necessarily just related to aging. So I just wanted to bring up some quotes from interviews that we've done with people here to highlight that. And often, a lot of time, people have developed coping mechanisms, or might be resigned to live with it, or might be very, very desperate for help and support and be looking for anything, and not always getting the help and support they might need. Interestingly, anxiety is often a lot less familiar to people, and it's something that they trivialize more. And so there needs to be a lot more raising of awareness in older people and its issues and the potential effects of that. So we've seen that it's such a big problem. What works? Firstly, as I'm sure you're all aware, the first line treatment through the health service is often antidepressants, typically SSRIs or SNRIs. And for most of the people who get a diagnosis of depression, this is what they'll be prescribed. And though they do show effects in younger people and the younger old, actually there's quite a recent systematic review which brings together all the trial-based evidence on these, looking at in older people who are specifically age 65 plus rather than sometimes the lower thresholds of 55 plus, and found that actually compared to a placebo, there's no effects on response, which is a 50% reduction in symptoms from their baseline, or on remission. But people were more likely to get side effects than with placebo. And we know there's also an increased risk of falls associated with antidepressants. There's a lot of emerging evidence around that now, as well as it sometimes putting people off seeking help. So I think it's a very important thing to say that although antidepressants are quite widely available, they're certainly not the be all or end all, particularly of mental health support in this population. There's also psychological treatments. So as you might be aware, there's the Improving Access to Psychological Therapies initiative through the NHS, and typically that focus is on cognitive behavioural therapy, which we do know is effective for depression and anxiety. The research does show that typically it's less effective for older adults than younger adults. And typically a lot of these studies focus on people who are kind of in their mid-60s rather than thinking about the whole range of lifespan going up to people in their sort of 75, 80 plus and what might work then. And we do know that there's issues with access to that, however, so only about half of the people who would be expected to access these therapies who are age 65 plus actually do. But we know that when they do access them, they're more likely to stay in a course of therapy than a younger person, and they're more likely to recover. So there's definitely, we do definitely need to encourage people to, I guess, take up these services to have access to good psychological therapies. And there's a number of other psychological therapies like life review, problem-solving therapy, and more kind of mindfulness-based therapies that are beginning to emerge in terms of having an evidence base for depression, anxiety in older people. But typically they're delivered and commissioned more in kind of the US or in other countries such as Spain and things like that at the moment. So that they show quite a lot of promising effects and really indicate a need, I guess, to broaden the different types of psychological therapies that are available to people. And just to highlight a couple of challenges with those, as I said, there's a real lack of access there. And there's also the idea of the postcode lottery, with some places having very long waiting lists, others having access to quite a lot of services. And particularly for older adults or people with long-term conditions, there's a real focus on physical health rather than mental health. And that's something we found that there's a constant priority just because healthcare professionals are kind of more familiar with physical health and its problems, or don't necessarily think it's within their remit. And one of the things that I'm sure you're all quite interested in is the idea of any sort of mobile internet technology, e-health, even just delivering services remotely, because typically in the pandemic, we've seen a lot of innovation in this area. We've seen lots of people trying out more kind of distance-based therapies, and where there is psychological therapy that's being delivered simply through, say, Skype, Zoom, any sort of remote calling or remote platform, they seem to be getting quite positive effects and quite similar effects to those delivered face-to-face, which is really promising. But ones which are using more kind of app-based approaches, actually there's very little in older people at the moment. And that might be partly because all the studies that we've seen so far, which have asked older people about this, show very little appetite for that kind of mental health support. But I think that might change over the years. But certainly so far, CBT delivered online also shows that actually as people get older, there might be less effects, and we're not entirely sure why that might be, but it might be related to engagement more than anything else. So there's a range of other treatments as well. As you know, mental health doesn't just exist in a vacuum, and one of those treatments is targeting loneliness, and there's lots of social prescribing initiatives particularly focused at this. And in terms of what the literature and what the evidence says on this is that yes, group activities, group support is likely to reduce loneliness, it's likely to have positive effects on mental health. But oftentimes these aren't particularly great quality studies, and there's lots of different types of social interventions that are very hard to draw parallels with each other, because it's often quite tailored to the situation that's there. So I think there's definitely a lot that needs to be done on this sort of treatments, and particularly I guess with loneliness, not just assuming it's the be all and end all as well, so that treating loneliness is the only way of treating mental health. Exercise also has a very good evidence base, so that definitely helps reduce depression, particularly in those in the younger old and in residential care. It's a little bit unclear if people with health conditions benefit less. It seems to be that is the case, which might relate a lot to people's mobility, ability to exercise and what they can do. But certainly exercise itself is definitely a good treatment, although as far as I'm aware, there's no specific guidance at the moment as to whether a particular type of exercise is more effective or whether you need to do it for a minimum amount of time. There's also what's called collaborative care, which is where one healthcare professional kind of takes charge of care and might organise, say, care for COPD and depression. So the person has just one point of contact and management rather than having to go to multiple healthcare professionals. And this again seems to be helpful, but more focused on kind of primary care and definitely people with kind of long-term conditions. And the final thing, I guess, is mind-body interventions. So if we're thinking about yoga, Tai Chi and similar, we definitely know that they are effective. It seems to be that yoga is slightly more effective than Tai Chi, but you need to do a certain minimum dose of Tai Chi. So more than 3 sessions a week is helpful, but less than that shows fewer effects. But this is all very much focused on people attending classes as well. So anything that's self-directed at home, the effects of that are pretty unclear at the moment. And I'm aware that we've not got that much time, so I'll just touch briefly on the sort of evidence base behind some nutrition in older people. So we know, for example, that vitamin D that low levels of vitamin D are associated with depression, but oddly, supplementation doesn't reduce symptoms of depression, which is interesting in itself and might be to do with, for example, different causal mechanisms. So people with depression might just not go out of the house very much, might have lower levels of vitamin D. So I think while there's a lot of evidence out there about how different minerals and vitamins might affect people's mental health, I guess the important thing that needs testing on the back of that is, well, if you supplement them, does that actually make a difference? Certainly it seems that omega-3 supplementation is effective in older people with mild to moderate depression, but not in those who are currently okay in terms of their mental health. It doesn't boost it further. And the calcium supplementation also seems to reduce the risk of depressive symptoms, whereas folic acid and B vitamin supplements don't reduce the risk of depression. And there's little on probiotics for mood in older people, whereas I think there's starting to emerge an evidence base in younger people that probiotics can be helpful for depression, but certainly there's little focus on this for older people. So it seems to be that actually healthy dietary patterns are the thing to look at in terms of effects on mental health, not necessarily individual nutrients, but there's a lot more that needs to be done in this area. So just a couple of slides highlighting what I think are some of the gaps and areas we need more innovation on. So as you might be able to tell, we need kind of more focus on anxiety, treating anxiety, finding ways that an older person can address it on their own without necessarily needing to access healthcare services. We need language that's targeted towards older people. There's a lot of dislike of terms like mental health, and terms like low mood and stress and worries are a little bit more accepted, but still there seems to be no sort of consensus on that. And people also tell us that they want things that are quite practical and help them keep feeling control and independent. So sometimes it's not necessarily talking about things, but things that allow them to take action in some way and get more self-efficacy and control over their own lives. And one thing that might be important for you all thinking about kind of innovation and marketing is that actually one of the things that we found was that older people often prefer having treatments recommended or endorsed by someone. And for them, that was typically a GP, as often people didn't view the voluntary sector as having input on mental health in that way. They didn't necessarily talk about things to their friends and recommend sort of treatments or mental health solutions in that way. But certainly a healthcare professional could kind of validate symptoms and recommend treatments. And that was a really important source of information for people. So just to say the key gaps, again, are more and better testing of alternative approaches. We do have quite a good evidence base, but we do need better testing, better trials. Similarly, effective medications that have less risk for people in terms of falls, improving access to existing treatments, thinking about how we can use technology in a good way and in a way that engages with older people in the way that they want to. Think about improving awareness, particularly of anxiety, and think about a lot of these studies focus on people in their sort of early mid-60s. So we need to think about those who are frailer as well, who might be in social care settings, and what might be helpful for them. So that was kind of my starter for this topic. And I'll stop sharing there, and hopefully if you have any questions, we can get a bit of a discussion going about mental health.
Okay, thank you very much, Rachel. Just for those of you who joined a little bit late, if I could ask you to rename yourself, to add your affiliation to your name. If you hover over your screen, there's 3 dots in the right-hand corner. Just click on that, click rename, put your affiliation next to it. That just helps people know who else is on the call. So Rachel, there's a lot of different directions that we can go with this. There's an awful lot of ground covered, I think, between nutrition, exercise, all these therapies. I'm wondering maybe if we should start with our sort of most immediate reality and the pandemic question, right? So we've all been suffering through this for far too long now. I wonder if you have any insight on what the pandemic effect has been on all the adults, and whether or not it's changed any of the thinking around some of these themes that you're talking about.
Yeah, so that's a really good place to start. So definitely during the pandemic, there's quite a lot of large-scale studies that have shown really that, yes, symptoms of depression, anxiety in older people have definitely gone up. There's all the contributing factors of things like bereavement, of loss of social support, not being able to see friends, not being able to get support from your children and grandchildren. And so that there has been a definite impact from the pandemic. But interestingly, there's some statistics that are showing that actually it's not as much as in young people. So there's some theories that older people might be a bit more resilient to this kind of situation, particularly if they are kind of used to living at home and not kind of going out as much anyway, if they have limited mobility. Or there's just the sort of, I guess, the stoicism side of things, where people might have experienced sort of more life events throughout their lifetime, particularly the sort of post-World War II kind of generation, are used to these sort of, have more stoicism about these sort of situations than younger people. So I think that's quite interesting, that although the levels of symptoms have gone up, it's not necessarily as much as in younger people in terms of mental health. But there's definitely a bit of a gap there, and I think it'll definitely inspire more movement online of things like psychological therapies, and might get more digital engagement with those. And there's definitely research that's been done to see if older people can engage with certain types of psychological therapies like behavioural activation, either over the phone or through the internet, through video calling and things like that. So I think there'll definitely be an appetite there for doing things remotely, for older people having been triggered to get online more and to do more digitally. But certainly there is a big impact there. And we're also starting to see suggestions from people that actually older people in particular might need support in re-emerging from lockdown. So those sort of things about, you've not got on a bus for over a year, you're still really worried about it, your confidence is really knocked. How can we support people in a way to be able to just take those first steps out again and regain some confidence about interacting with the wider world?
So yeah, there's an awful lot in that response as well. I mean, I think that it does sound like that there is, from the earlier presentation you made, that there's an awful lot to be extremely concerned about when it comes to the impact of mental health in older workers. And it does seem there's an extraordinary lack of research or understanding, I think, around some of these questions. So it's good to see that there may be a silver lining somewhat for this population. Just picking up on that theme that you're talking about with regard to digital engagement, it is clearly an impact. And I'm curious, if we could maybe delve into a little bit more that kind of question of technology and what does it mean, or what are the effective technologies in this space? Maybe before we go into that, you mentioned the role of technology here on your slide. What is that role for you? How do you see this role of technology being?
These kind of two roles, really. The first is using it as a way to connect people either to others, so just in terms of like social connections, but also to connect them to healthcare professionals when needed. So if they can access counselling support, CBT support, anything like that digitally, it's facilitating that. But then there's also, you get the emergence of kind of CBT-based apps or meditation apps or any of the kind of mindfulness calming style apps that potentially could be attractive to older users, although I think at the moment aren't necessarily targeted to them. Certainly a lot of the research on apps for mental health does seem to be focused very much on sort of people in their 20s, 30s. But we are noticing trends that more and more people, particularly in their early 60s, are using smartphones, digital technology, engaging with things.
Yeah, maybe if we just pause. I mean, the question of this session is the science behind the systems, right? So what do we actually know that is evidence-backed, in this area? What are the things that you can sort of hand on heart say this is true about the impacts of X technology or otherwise?
Yeah, and it's a bit of a difficult one, because certainly in terms of for older people, there's not a lot really in terms of apps. There's just not a lot that's been tested and has a good evidence base in older people. And I think that's partly because the speed at which apps are produced, they're adapted, they're taken up and used is much faster than the process of research, and things tend to get outdated quite quickly. So in terms of, and there are kind of online CBT platforms that do seem to work for people aged 65 plus, but at the moment there's very, very little in terms of like apps and testing them that is focused and targeted at older people that I can say hand on heart is completely effective. I think there needs to be a lot more done in this area.
In this area and in many others from what your presentation was saying earlier. We do have some questions coming in on the chat. I would encourage everyone to add your thoughts and questions into the chat, and I will turn to them. I'd much rather field your questions or put your questions, Rachel, than mine. So we've got a question here from Adrian Berg, who's the director of the Catalyst Institute. Has the issue of work or volunteerism a difference in mental health? She feels that the loss of purpose caused by aging is a factor in mental health that causes psychological issues. So Rachel, I don't know if you could respond to Adrian's point there.
Yeah, I mean, certainly we know that having a purpose and meaning in life is particularly important sort of post-retirement for people, and having those kind of commitments and purpose is definitely seen as an important thing in people's life that does promote positive mental health. In terms of whether or not a lot of voluntary services are supported by people who are recently retired, certainly. In terms of the effects of the pandemic in reducing people's availability to volunteer and things like that, I think we're seeing some of the effects of that now in terms of effects on depression, but I don't think it's been looked at particularly on those two issues in a kind of causal way alone.
Adrienne, you're more than welcome to comment or respond on that if you would like.
Well, I'm just saying that there's always been this need for looking at the holistic view of how we're aging. The Catalyst Institute is about geroscience, and it's about extending lifespan and health span. But the reason that I got hired, let's say, is I said, look, you're going to give us all these years of health. What are we going to do with our time? And that was a kind of an in-your-face statement of my concern that, well, I think they'll make it listening to us. So many of these other wonderful speakers at the other geroscience-oriented conferences, and this one in particular. But if there's no place for us in society, the mental health issues are going to be just as great, let's say, as the biological and dementia issues that we have today. And I'm very worried about that. I'm just worried about this idea of obsolescence. And I just was wondering, for you being on the front line of mental health of elders, whether you're seeing this as opposed to a real condition, a psychosis, a neurosis, a depression. And I am looking at that cause and effect. I'm not a scientist, and I'm not on that level, but I'm looking to see if there's some direct cause and effect between this lack of purpose issue that many of us face after 70, and kind of an imposed, retirement means to withdraw. And I just don't like that whole issue. So I am looking for something concrete about that to bring to the table of the narrative.
Rachel, is there anyone you could point Adrienne in the direction of that might be able to provide answers to that, or do you have a thought yourself?
I guess in terms of that, we do certainly know that as people get older and as they retire and as their sort of, I guess their field narrows, but people cope with that by focusing very much on the day-to-day and kind of have their routines and set them. And even just having social events and things in their calendar is often a lot of what keeps people going in terms of mental health and finding those things to keep going. But certainly having that sense of purpose, absolutely, it's a massive contributor to mental health. And we do notice that people they do get some depressive symptoms from that when the sort of days are very similar and there's kind of no difference or driving force there. Maybe less so the really severe cases where we've noticed that tends to be more linked to kind of severe life events and past traumas, but certainly those kind of symptoms of apathy of not being able to do much, or I think it does get people in a sort of negative cycle, definitely.
Okay, I wanted to turn. Thank you for that contribution, Adrienne, and the response, Rachel. I think is it Becerra? Forgive me if I mispronounce it. Bishara, sorry. I think Bishara had a comment about I think some research, or soon to be published research on mindfulness apps. So, do you want to comment and let us know what that's about?
Yeah, I'd love to. First, I'd like to say to Adrienne, it's not just the elderly that are searching for purpose. Some people consider it to be the next real big problem facing humanity, purpose/meaning, and I think that's true, actually. But I did want to make a comment about some research that's coming out with some of our collaborators. I'm the CEO and the chief scientist at Mobile Interactive. We're a digital therapeutics company. We made the first mindfulness app that outperformed placebo in a randomized controlled trial. When we've since done that twice. Both of these first two RCTs were done in younger populations, but we have recently completed a randomized clinical trial with cancer survivors, many of whom were over 60, over 65 even. And here we've discovered the same effect size as group psychotherapy for reducing fear of cancer recurrence, as well as reducing overall stress and symptoms associated with affect disorders and other things that are quite commonly comorbid with cancer, even post treatment and recovery. So there is evidence based out there. Of course, it takes us a lot of time. I was a principal investigator at the psychiatry hospital in Zurich here before I quit and focused full time on the company. And what's great is that the regulators are coming to realize that yes, apps, digital therapeutics need to change rapidly. And so they're working around a framework where you can get a product approved and an agreed upon level of changes before you would need to then do a restudy. So I just wanted to bring that to your attention. It should be out probably in one of the JMRI journals. We published the protocol already in JMRI protocols. So there is stuff out there for sure, and it's always been really prevalent for us. Just wanted to mention that.
Brilliant. I'll keep out for it.
It's called AMDTX, if you want to check it out. AMDTX.
Thank you, Bashara, for that. We had another question coming in from the comments. Julie from We Sleep. Rather than me reading it, do you maybe want to put the question in your own words and speak?
I was trying to avoid this. Hi. Yeah, what came to mind is whether you saw any difference between men and women across all the things that you've looked into. That was the first question. And then the second question was a little bit of a selfish one, because I'm in the area of sleep, and sleep therapy is, because I know that, you know, clinically proven close correlation between depression, anxiety, and sleep. And so in all of the options that you presented, sleep wasn't part of it. And I was just wondering if there was a reason for that, or if it just hasn't proven to be effective with the elderly.
Yes, two really interesting questions. In terms of differences between men and women, not so much, or at least not on a consistent level across studies. Certainly, yeah, nothing of note that we've noticed. But in terms of the sort of levels of depression, anxiety in older people, or treatment effects by men and women, or anything like that, actually, it broadly seems to be consistent. Across everyone, really. And the more notable differences have tended to be by kind of how frail people are, and how many health conditions they have, or how able or dependent they are, in terms of partly of what they can do, and what might change, more so than gender, I think. And very interesting point about sleep quality. Yeah, I didn't touch upon that much because it's such a big topic anyway, and that I've covered in the presentation. But you're right that it's very important. It's very closely, well, we know for the older people's do tend to sleep for less hours a night, do tend to get less good quality sleep, and obviously there are impacts of that on mental health. I don't think, to my knowledge, I don't know loads about sleep and insomnia and effective treatments for that, but to my knowledge, there's nothing that's particularly effective for older people at the moment, that's viewed as, I think it's still a bit of a thing where people get prescribed things like benzodiazepines and other quite strong hypnotic drugs, but otherwise there's not so much, particularly for older people, to do for themselves to help sleep, and particularly in terms of other effective mechanisms. So I think there's not a lot out there, to my knowledge, and that's something that we'd like to see more of, probably, because I do think there is a bit of a lack of joined up thinking with some of these with some of these treatments and with some of these factors. So I wonder if you yourself are doing anything particularly for...
No, well, the thing is, it's interesting, because I always thought it's very difficult to help the elderly around all of these issues, you know, depression, anxiety, and sleep, you know, wrapped around that. It's just not that easy. Besides what you mentioned in terms of prescribed medication, and, you know, I'm not a GP, but melatonin seems to be something that is prescribed and apparently works better for the elderly than for the younger populations, you know, apparently. But I don't think it's true of everyone, and that it works systematically. But it's just a difficult thing it's more difficult to support the elderly, you know, and just sort of older adults than younger adults when it comes to sleep. But we know the correlation between sleep, depression, and anxiety, it's huge, you know, 5 to 10 times more likely to be depressed, and I've heard up to 17 times more likely to be anxious with sleep deprivation, you know, so it's so closely related. So yeah, all I know is about melatonin on top of what you said. So yeah, that's why I was interested in it.
Yeah, and it'd be interesting to see more developments in this area. I do think what you're saying about depression, anxiety being difficult to address, I think there is evidence that we can reduce depression, anxiety. I think a lot of people fear that it's all related to aging, so you can't really address it because the aging part of it is almost inevitable. But I think there's definitely possibilities there. There's definitely things that say, yeah, we can reduce depressive symptoms and anxiety symptoms in older people. It's just, I think for some people, it's just finding the right treatment for their situation.
So can we stick on that a little bit, Rachel? Because I think in your presentation you mentioned a number of things that worked for younger populations, but didn't seem to work for older populations. I mean, you know, SSRIs, for example, you mentioned more effective in younger people, not so much in older people. CBT as well, which is, you know, very hot at the moment, obviously, seems to be more effective for younger people, not for older people. So what are the things or the interventions, you know, that do work for reducing depression and anxiety in older populations?
So one of the really promising ones, I guess, is problem-solving therapy, which is a sort of, I guess not quite stripped back kind of psychological therapy, but a very straightforward one that's quite easy to train non-psychological therapists in. So it's very much about practical action and getting people to, it's based on the idea that people have everyday issues that are aggravating their depression. And if you can help people to solve those, that both gets rid of the source of depression and it helps people have a sense of self-efficacy, which does chime quite well with what older people have told us in various studies about wanting to take control of things and feel a bit more empowered. So that's something that definitely shows promise and is quite easy to train people in. So it's used a lot in the US, but for some reason here it hasn't really taken off so much, but it's a very sort of straightforward approach, if you like, to getting people to listing their issues, coming up with ways to solve them, really making those changes, and then sort of evaluating, reflecting on those and trying to find a way to solve these sort of issues moving forward. And I think that can be really helpful for people to, even if it's just everyday things like, you know, they're entitled to a benefit that they're not sure how to get or something like that, that those kind of practical approaches can help people to find that kind of confidence to take those steps to be able to do those things for themselves in future. And I guess particularly if say they're on their own now, spouse has died or something like that, that helps people regain some skills and confidence to be able to sort things out for themselves. So I think that's definitely a promising therapy that we've found does really reduce symptoms of depression, anxiety, and that goes for people who are sort of in their 70s, 80s, who are quite frail, as well as those in their kind of mid 60s.
No, that's super interesting. I mean, what is it that you think is the barrier here to adoption or widespread adoption of that intervention? Is it just simply an awareness problem, or is it far more complex than that?
I think it's a bit of an awareness problem, and I think it's very hard to change NHS systems sometimes, and they're very wedded to the systems that they've got in terms of the kind of stepped care approach, where people with symptoms will get sort of bibliotherapy at first, or might get low intensity psychological therapies that are then upgraded a bit more, but it's very much around that kind of CBT model and stepped approach, and trying to get a bit more flexibility in that is always, of course, very difficult. So I think it's just hard to change a sort of system like that, but certainly if there's more we can do to make those kind of things available digitally, that would be great to see. Or if there's more that we can do outside of the sort of NHS structures.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, I wonder if there are further questions from the floor here. I have one or two more questions that I'd like to put before we kind of wrap things up. But if you do have any final questions, please put them in the session. So maybe a good place to sort of go now, Rachael, is to kind of look at what you see as, you know, in all of the things that you have talked about, you know, what is the most effective strategy that we can take here to address these problems. And you've mentioned a number of different, you know, I guess interventions or ideas, but is there in your mind, a very simple, strong message here of a strategy that we should be pursuing and adopting?
So to me, there's I think one of the things to say is that a range of things should be offered to people. We need to sort of think, how can we give people a menu of options rather than assuming there's one thing that will be the panacea for mental health that will solve all the problems. You know, digital will work for some people, face-to-face will work for some people, antidepressants will work for some people, but can we get that out there as a menu to people? So can we say, look, we know these work, these are your options, and just give people the range of different ways that they can be supported and help them access what is most useful for them, and trying to, I guess, not just assume that one thing will work, but have somewhere where people can really see all the different options and say, yes, you know what, this is this will work for me, and then pointing them to, then sort of signposting them to how they can get that, because there's a little bit of that goes on in kind of social prescribing, but that's all very social, local groups focused, and doesn't really think about, well, these are all the apps that are available, this is what you can do nutritionally, this is what you can try here. And I think there's a real lack of empowerment and lack of a good information space for older people, because apart from their GP, people don't really tend to think, oh, I'm going to look at information about this on, say, an Age UK website, or there's not much there on that kind of thing. So I think it's really, I think it's having that menu and getting that menu of things across and accessible.
I think that's really interesting. It speaks obviously to kind of the trend that we're seeing now of personalized medicine and personalized nutrition, and everything being tailored to the individual, right? And from what you're saying, that clearly needs to happen in this case. We're coming to the end here. Maybe just ask one final question, Rachel, and that's for you to kind of take out your crystal ball here, and you know, tell us what you think the state of this debate is going to be in 5 years' time. You know, what's going to change between now and 5 years? In your view, except it's an entirely subjective one, but do tell us what's your crystal ball telling you?
Oh, yeah, it's a difficult one to forecast exactly, but I think definitely a move towards sort of digital health and looking at how we can best support particularly older populations with that, now that the pandemic has forced a lot of people to move to digital situations. I think there will be a lot of emphasis on the social side of things coming out of the pandemic as well. So even more emphasis on kind of social prescribing, on getting local groups together, on facilitating those kind of things. And what I would hope to see would be a kind of more holistic look at mental health in later life, and not a kind of assumption that it's all down to old age, but really looking at that person as an individual and their life circumstances and everything surrounding that. That's where I think that's where I see the field going, but we need to keep attention up in this, I think, because it does occasionally get swept under the carpet, older adults' mental health, or kind of forgotten about a little bit. And I think it's something that needs to be constantly highlighted.
Okay, thank you very much, Rachel. And I think that's probably a good place to end it. It does seem like there is cause for optimism here, if your vision of the future is correct. And I thank you very much for the contribution, for your thoughts, and everyone who took the time to be with us today. I hope you do enjoy the rest of the sessions at the Healthspan Show, and I look forward to connecting with you all in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
And
Terry.
over to you, Ange.
Yeah, thanks, Terry. And of course, thanks so much, Rachel, for that brilliant session. And thank you all for getting involved and for asking your questions. If you have any other questions you'd like to put to Rachel, you can use the partnering system to follow up with her. And Rachel, you'll get an email. So, you know, feel free to use that if you'd like to put any other additional questions to her. But in the meantime, full marks to this session for finishing on time. I think you're the first one today to do so. So well done. And it means that everyone can finally go and get a quick cup of tea before our next session. So we've got a really great panel coming up, looking at some of the fantastic emerging models that are coming out for testing, tracking, even biohacking. So do stick around for that. We'll see you soon. But in the meantime, thanks very much, everyone, and goodbye.